I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And for this WISAT segment of In the New Republic, I had a discussion with Professor Jonathan Sarna, the Joseph R. and Bella R. Braun University Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. And for this segment, we went back in time to 1990, when Dr. Sarna returned back to Brandeis as a professor and delivered an inaugural lecture of a theme which I think still has resonance today.
Your first lecture was titled, I believe, From Synagogue Community to Community of Synagogues. It eventually becomes a very important section in your 2004 book, but it very much explores, with great nuance, the role of the synagogue, the role of the community, and change, historical change in the years around the turn of the 19th century.
So that indeed is a theme that had interested me for a long time, and eventually I put it together. And to my mind, in many ways, it is the moment when we can begin to speak about American Judaism, meaning that it's something different than what had previously existed. In every one of the North American Jewish communities, meaning Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Newport, in the colonial and early American era, we had exactly one synagogue. It united the community. Indeed, the synagogue and the community was one and the same, and the synagogue frequently spoke on behalf of the Jewish community, and even Jews who lived beyond the synagogue and only would come a few times a year, they were part of the community. They were expected to pay dues.
If you wanted to have access to kosher meat, if you wanted to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, you were beholden to that establishment.
The synagogue, exactly. All of the functions of a traditional Jewish community were now handled by the synagogue. Now, you may wonder, why is that? And we know the answer. You used to have, in the medieval period, everyone studies the kehilah, the organized Jewish community. But as you begin to move into modernity, everyone's worried that's a state within a state that will call the whole Jewish community into question. Are they really loyal? And therefore, you said, well, we can do what many of the churches do, and we'll be a community, what the Catholics call a parish, but it'll be under religious auspices. It won't cause a problem. But you can really see this happening in some of the Caribbean communities where synagogues actually merge to create one synagogue, because you no longer wanted to have the traditional communal structure. It's too dangerous. In North America, you never had the kind of kehilah structure, but the synagogue effectively took it over, acted like the old Jewish community did with all of those functions. And that lasts from 1654 really into the beginning of the 19th century. But after the American Revolution, it's clear that there are more and more tensions, and you can begin to see a whole variety of episodes in which young Jews chafe at the leadership of the synagogue community. Naturally, there is a big generation gap, but in many ways, they're asking, why are we beholden to this? Isn't it a free country? Why can't we be like our neighbors? America had seceded from England. Why can't we secede? At first, you see them challenging on matters of Jewish law. And then in New York, there's a whole issue of who controls kosher food. The synagogue had controlled kosher food. People said, that's a free country. Why can't we have a shochet, a ritual slaughter, outside of the synagogue? And you have a whole series of these episodes leading up to 1824-25, when in the two largest Jewish communities, New York and Charleston, you actually see the communities divide. Now, the stories are a little different in some ways, but in other ways, they're the same. In both cases, you have young Jews worried, will Judaism survive? Somewhat disillusioned with the way the extant Sephardic synagogue communities are being run. These young Jews challenge the leadership. In Charleston, famously, they are quote unquote reformers, meaning they've been influenced by, in the case of Charleston, by liberal Protestantism, the Unitarian movement. And in Charleston, they put out a long, famous document. They want an English language service. They interestingly want rich and poor to be treated alike. Again, you see the influence of democracy. They don't like the system of raising funds for the synagogue, which similarly seems to them elitist. And they give in this petition. Naturally, the leadership of the synagogue is horrified by this petition. They want to change. Sephardic Jews imagine that tradition is what keeps Judaism alive. It's the very fact that we don't change, that we are similar to Sephardic congregations, Western Sephardic congregations in Amsterdam, in London, in the Caribbean. And change is the most frightening idea. And yet these young Jews believe that unless we make changes, our children won't belong. So they secede from the synagogue of Beth Elohim, and they set up their own in Charleston Reformed Society of Israelites. In New York, it's a little different. The young Jews want an early morning service. They want explanations. They are, in a sense, more traditional than the synagogue. It sounds like something between a learner's service and a chavurah that they're calling for. Fascinatingly, they use the name in Hebrew, which is significant. Chevrat Chinuch Ne'arim. They call themselves. They are young. They haven't had the opportunity to learn. They want education. But they too demand changes. The leadership is more polite, but they basically say once we start making changes, who knows where it will end? Of course, there are other factors, and Gershom Seixas, who used to keep everyone together and was so beloved, has died, and the Jewish community has begun to move out of the older areas where they had lived. All of those factor in, but at the end of the day, the same thing happens. Young Jews secede, and eventually they found the congregation, B'nai Jeshurun, which they call Ashkenazic. That is a means of legitimating what they've done. Well, like London and Amsterdam, there'll be Ashkenazi and Sephardi congregations, but it's the same people. And in Shearith Israel had a majority of Ashkenazim, we now know, probably since 1720, but now that becomes the legitimation, the way of making it seem kosher to divide, but it's not the call. In New York and Charleston, we suddenly move from synagogue community to a community that has, in each case, two synagogues, and that changes everything, because suddenly Jews are not united by the synagogue. They're divided by synagogues. They have to find other ways to unite. Moreover, there's competition. And if there's competition, that means that the whole authority structure of the synagogue has to change. Because if this synagogue finds me, I'll go to that synagogue and give them my dues. And suddenly, synagogues need congregants more than congregants need any particular synagogue.
This is much inspired by the early republic. And so their new constitutions, as you pointed out in other articles, begin, "We the people," or "We the Israelites."
Exactly. And the Constitution of B'nai Jeshurun exactly defined.
And in Virginia and Philadelphia and
They all use the same document. And so we have a totally new idea that comes in. It's really based on congregationalism, which is still the basic mode of the American Jewish community. Now it's going to create competition. And between 1825 and 1860, which is not a long period of time, every Jewish community in the United States of any size is going to have multiple synagogues. And of course, by the Civil War, New York has at least 10. It changes the whole nature of the synagogue. One only need look at England to see a different model, where you had still a chief rabbi, a leadership model that's centralized top down. England is influenced by Anglicanism with its top-down structure, and America is influenced by Congregationalism, which doesn't have that top-down structure. And of course, the democracy and Republican ideas have moved from the world of politics into the world of the synagogue, and reshaped it. And American Judaism is really here emergent. It's going to have a distinctive character, but it's also never the same as it was in the preceding 170 years, where the synagogue unified Jews, and there was one synagogue, all Jews came under it. Now, the synagogue, in a sense, divides Jews, and we're going to have to find other ways, whether it's B'nai B'rith or later Jewish federations and other institutions to unite Jews. But the synagogue, synagogues are going to divide them, and many of the functions that synagogues had taken on to define a community are now going to be offloaded either as independent entities or to new central organizations. B'nai B'rith in 1843, when it's founded, similarly is on account of the fact that Jews are no longer united by the synagogue, so now maybe we will unite them by a fraternal organization. But it all comes from this move, from synagogue community to community of synagogues, one of the great revolutions in the history of American Judaism.
And it's an American revolution. It is only to be understood in the context of American religion. Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.